Very fitting, of course. I'm not doing that again. It's very fitting that we're holding this event, of course, in the European Studies Centre. This was Tony's academic home throughout his career. And I wanted to start by thanking the fellows at the European Studies Centre for hosting the event today, and particularly to Julie Adams, who's done all the work and has managed to get the technology so far working. So let me just start by saying a few words about Tony as an Antonian. Tony's career is completely intertwined with the history of St. Antony's, although it is not actually true that the college was named after him, which sometimes used to like to tell people. St. Antony's was actually founded in 1950, and Tony only arrived, I say only arrived, in, I think it was the 8th cohort, doing a B-Phil here in 1959 to 1960. In October 1961, he was elected. It's incredible how quickly this happened. He was elected to a Rockefeller Research Fellowship in, and this is a citation, in recent German history, specializing in the Weimar Republic. And that was a position he held until 1968, when he became a special non-CUF lecturer at the university. Now, a special non-CUF lectureship is the kind of job title that only Oxford could invent. But it was the mechanism by which the Central University could relieve a relatively modest part of the cost that was being borne by the college, or by some of the graduate colleges, which were providing an increasing amount of teaching for undergraduate and graduate teaching. It was limited to only 3 colleges, had this special position: St. Antony's, Nuffield, and I must confess, somewhat surprisingly, All Souls. And in St. Antony's, as far as I can tell, it was only ever given to 2 people, one of whom was Richard Story, and the other one was Tony. I think it would be true to say that Tony was very proud of this rather esoteric title we like to tell people about. Tony was a member of the St. Antony's College governing body for very close to 40 years. If anybody's attended any governing body meetings, it's something to bear thinking about. And in those days, of course, governing body meetings weren't like they are today, twice a term. They were at least 4 times a term. And I can assure you they went on for much longer than they do today. He joined in 1964, and he joined as part of what appears to have been a mini revolution. I never thought of Tony as a revolutionary, but it was a mini revolution against the then warden Bill Deakin and the then sub-warden James Jodd, who had both decreed that a governing body of no more than 13 was the right size. I tend to agree with them, actually, but anyway, and that this, but even though being at the size of 13, this disenfranchised a substantial section of the senior members of the college. And Tony and John Campbell were elected to represent this disenfranchised group, and Tony remained on the governing body from that year until he retired in 2001 and became an emeritus fellow. Tony had many roles in the college during his career, but he will be particularly remembered, I suspect, for 2 roles. He succeeded Richard Story as the library fellow in 1978, and he helped to build up the college's library collection of books and archives so energetically in the subsequent years that the college had to impose restrictions on itself to stop accepting whole collections from donors. So that was one of his roles. Then also for much of the 1990s, Tony was senior tutor in the college. And that role essentially involved helping students navigate the increasing complexity of university bureaucracy that had become almost as difficult as writing an actual thesis itself. No one understood that complexity better than Tony. In fact, I'm not sure that anybody understood it except for Tony. There'll be many people here today who, and online as well, who will be forever indebted to Tony for sorting out the tangles they got themselves into. Always wanted that to happen. So how do I know all of this about Tony? How do I know these facts about Tony? I know them in part because I myself arrived in St. Antony's in 1982, and so I witnessed a lot of it myself, but mainly because all of these facts, of course, are recorded in the official history of St. Antony's, written by one Christine Nicholls. Here it is. This is my prop. This has actually been my Bible since I arrived as warden in the college. Christine herself, of course, is one of the first, I think, 5 female students in the first cohort. I want to say which year that was, Christine. So I'm confident that everything I've just told you must be true because it's in the college history. And I'm equally confident that everything that you're about to hear from the other speakers will also be a true and accurate record. So let me pass on immediately to the first of our speakers this evening, and that is Caroline Nicholls, who needs no introduction. We'll talk about Tony as an angry man. Over to you, Caroline.
Professor Anthony Nicholls had many different names in our household. None of them had any respect for his status as an academic. There was no nod to his recognition by the German government, his publications, or his position within the university. To us, he was just our dad, Pater, Pates, sometimes D. He wasn't particularly interested in material possessions. As long as it worked, he didn't really seem to mind what car he drove or what the house looked like. I always imagined he was concerned with loftier things. He was interested in his family, ideas, people, politics, football, German railways. He believed in social responsibility and doing the right thing, but he preached it. He would listen intently to our dubious, selfish, political and social ideas, and then he would gently point out the flaws in our arguments and make us think analytically. He gave us stern warnings to be wary of politicians, to think carefully about what we were being told, to never sign petitions that might have an impact on our future career. We knew a little bit about his job. It was a treat to visit him in this office here, in this building, where there was always a packet of his favourite plain chocolate digestive biscuits. We borrowed his and my mother's subfuss to use as bat costumes at Halloween. We looked forward to the Christmas parties here at St Anthony's, with rather random entertainment, magicians and a Father Christmas and going away toffee apples. We always knew that he was fascinated by Germany. He made many work trips there, and as young children we missed him. But we eagerly anticipated his return because he always brought back presents. Well, one present in particular, a very specific box of chocolates. It was a packet of German assorted tobacco products consisting of chocolate cigars, chocolate cigarettes, and chocolate matches. And we loved this present, but I'm not sure that parents of today would approve of it. Academia was something that was a very big part of my father. He was often found working in his study or reading some large book at the kitchen table. If he wasn't reading a book, he was probably writing one. But he was also very much a family man. He was usually the first up and spent 10 minutes engaged in physical jerks. And this was a strange combination of sit-ups and other exercises that he performed on the carpet in his pajamas. And then he would make our breakfast with very specific requests from all of us. And then there was supper, which was meat and overboiled vegetables. He will certainly not be remembered as a gourmet chef. And there was a sigh of relief in my family when a microwave arrived at the end of the 80s. There's very good reason that both my sister and I married men who can cook. At home, he was often sporting an apron. In fact, he rarely remembered to take it off, and it used to be excruciatingly embarrassing when yet again he would be waiting to collect us at primary school gates, still wearing it. He was rather vague about things like collecting his children, and on one memorable occasion forgot to pick my little sister Izzy up from orchestra practice, leaving her waiting in the snow for quite some time. Apart from Germany, and of course his family, one of my father's other great loves was Arsenal Football Club. His favourite footballer was Ronnie Rook, the Arsenal centre forward in the late 1940s. And one day Ronnie visited my dad's school, and from that moment he became a hero of his. My dad saw him blast a penalty at Stamford Bridge, and it was memorable enough for him to recount it to my brother in perfect detail 30 years later. And from that moment, Alex was a gunner too, and by default, so were the rest of us. Alex and my dad used to go to Highbury Stadium every year, and one game in 1985 was particularly memorable. They were playing Leicester City, who were an average team, but they had a decent centre forward, Gary Lineker. And nothing much happened for the first 88 minutes. It was 0-0. Already some frustrated supporters were leaving. But suddenly a through ball sent Lineker charging towards the goal, and it was 1-0 to Leicester. And there was the sound of the old wooden seats backs clattering up as most of the Arsenal fans decided to leave. We're staying, my dad reassured Alex. There's still time. And there was. An hour later, they were eating their favourite burgers in the Wimpy Bar on the Holloway Road. The final score, 2-1 to Arsenal, with goals in the 90th and 92nd minutes. My dad's calm belief that things would usually work out in the end on that occasion had come to pass. But for me, the quality that my father had that stands out the most was his kindness. And it's a quality that is not often valued as highly as it should be. He would spend hours listening to our problems. He was a calming presence in a house full of volatile teenagers, even calm when Izzy brought her horses for a graze on the lawn in the back garden. He was extremely funny. He had a brilliant dry humour. He welcomed his son-in-laws, Ian and Will, into the family with open arms, and he was always interested in what they were doing. He loved hearing about our lives and was there to help in any situation. He made sure we knew he was proud of us. When Izzy became ill in 2002, he steadily supported her and Ian and the rest of us, and continued to do so throughout her long rehabilitation. And this kindness extended right through to the end of his life when he was faced with the prospect of Alzheimer's. He managed his illness with courage and dignity. And although I'm sure he was very scared, in front of us he always remained resolutely positive. In the last few months of his life, I often found myself talking to him about things that were worrying me. At this point, I don't think he knew who I was, and he was barely able to move. He couldn't do anything for himself. But he would always hold my hand and pat it and smile. Even then, he was still our dad. He was still making sure that we were all okay. Tony Nicholls was a kind and gentle and generous man. He was a wonderful father and a wonderful husband.
I've been asked to talk about memories of Tony as an undergraduate tutor. When I asked to give the eulogy at his funeral last year, I phoned a good friend of mine, a fellow student of his, Alison Powell, who, like me, had been tutored by him as an undergrad, then postgrad. We talked for over an hour and a half, reminiscing about him. However, I have to condense this into a much shorter time. To quote Alison, Tony was a gentle, kind, friendly, encouraging, and humane man. Not necessarily the first characteristics that spring to mind when describing a high-powered academic, always accessible and approachable. I met Tony at the beginning of my second year in 1977 as an undergraduate at St. Hugh's. He tutored me, like Alison earlier, for all my European history papers. This was one of the luckiest chances of my life. On arriving at St. Hugh's, my college buddy advised me to make sure that I was tutored outside college as much as possible by someone or some people with good reputations. Neither tutoring or pastoral care were fortes of my alma mater in those days. Tony had a good reputation. Suffering from imposter syndrome, as I came from comprehensive, and at sea in the Oxford system, after my first year, I had completely lost all my confidence. During my first term with him in my second year, I suffered a breakdown and was on the verge of leaving Oxford and my degree. But Tony gently supported me week by week. He reduced pressure by abandoning the weekly essay. He showed me how and why a reading list was compiled, how to gut it, how to tackle historical questions, and bring an essay plan for discussion. Gradually, confidence in my ability was built up again with Tony's patient encouragement and enthusiasm for the subject. His use of humour was gentle and ironic and was disarming. One comment scribbled in his sometimes difficult to read handwriting stated, "You must use shorter paragraphs. Try to be more like AJP Taylor in this, but nothing else." Alison, who subsequently went on to have a very successful career in the city, felt similarly supported. She said of him, "We were never patronised or made to feel stupid, and like many other tutors I will not name. I think he was the only tutor who offered me chocolate digestives. Normally, just as I was about to read my essay, which caused me no end of embarrassment, which to tackle first. Sometimes we would just plan and talk through essay titles. We weren't given great long reading lists so he could show off his own erudition, but carefully selected books and articles with pointers as to which titles to concentrate on. It didn't come as a complete surprise later to find that he had served on the University Student Health Committee and had shown concern and compassion for students' physical and mental health, supported by Christine, his wife, plugging great gaps in student welfare with highly valued student manuals. The high point of my academic experiences in undergrad came in my third year with a special subject on the Third Reich, taught by Tony and his colleague Tim Mason of St. Peter's, who sadly died much too young. It was one of the best topics on offer, taught by this formidable pair, with Tim sparking amazing ideas and Tony anchoring them in detail and in the wider context. It was a stimulating experience as an undergraduate being taught by scholars who were opening up archives as we studied. This and the weekly postgraduate seminars in this room in Woodstock Road was heady stuff. I remember sitting enthralled listening to a young Ian Kershaw talking through some of the fascinating work he'd done on wartime German public opinion, looking at published death notices, among other things. It made us want to do research. These seminars were also instigated by Tony and were part of a great academic exchange between experts and students, British and German academics and politicians that Tony initiated and fostered throughout his 40 years at St. Antony's. Communication and understanding were always at the heart of his work. The summer of finals, I was doing an admin job for the OCR board up in Summertown when someone told me I'd got a first. I thought they were pulling my leg. I cycled down to look at the results, and incredibly I had. On the way back, I stopped here at 70 Woodstock, where Tony's old estate car was parked, and went to thank him for my degree, which I knew I owed him. Without his help and support, I might never have survived my 3 years, let alone get that result. He was immensely kind and considerate. He wasn't just interested in our intellectual abilities or academic potential. He was practical. Students are often short of funds. He seemed to have an endless supply of suggestions as to how we could earn money, from fixing students up with A-level tutoring to maternity cover in Banbury FE College. I ended up house, cat, and dad sitting for him over holidays, also teaching his son French grammar, and I remember babysitting certain 3 individuals. When I went off to Hamburg on the Hanseatic scholarship, which he had suggested I try for, he stored my belongings in his garden shed and then surprised me with a request. His bike had been stolen from outside schools. He wondered if he could borrow my old battered girl's bike while I was away in Germany. I couldn't refuse, but it did make me smile at the thought of this tall, lanky man riding down the Woodstock Road on my too small girl's bike. Wonderfully practical and unpretentious, Tony had a great ability not to worry about appearances and things that didn't matter. He introduced us to some of the best German historians of our time. Sadly, most of them are now gone, hoping to open doors for us and our research. I remember meeting Fritz Fischer as a first year at St. Antony's in an intimate lunch with Tony and Ralph Darendorf, then warden. We were discussing German war aims of 1914 while I was trying to winkle a cream prawn out of its shell, a skill unknown to me at the time. I eventually gave up on my war effort with the prawn, hid its mangled corpse under a lettuce leaf, and concentrated on the great man himself. Although the prof was no longer teaching by my time in Hamburg, the Fishers became good friends, and I enjoyed many visits to their home in Blankenese, discussing German history and the rising tide of nationalism in the Balkans, which had by then started to rear its ugly head. Although he encouraged us into scholarship, Tony was not narrow-minded or fixated on academia. He encouraged both Alison and myself into careers in the city. As Alison concluded in a letter to me, how lucky we were to have had such a man as a key influence at this crucial late stage in our lives. We really are in his debt, even now.
The video of Richard Evans. He recorded last night. No, that's not Richard Evans. That is Richard Evans.
Hello, I'm Richard Evans. I'm Research Professor Emeritus of History at Cambridge University, but I did my undergraduate degree in history at Oxford and also my DPhil. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person or live to join this series of tributes to Tony, but I have a long-standing commitment to go to Bratislava actually to deliver a lecture on the current threats of democracy for the centenary of the birth of Alexander Dubček. I first began my acquaintance, my long friendship with Tony as an undergraduate. I was sent to him by my tutor at Jesus College, John Walsh, to take a term's tutorials on modern European history. So I went along to his rooms, excuse me, and I found he was a kind, gentle, engaging, and well-prepared tutor. That contrasted with some of my other tutors as an undergraduate, some of whom didn't bother to prepare anything at all, also whom were very stimulating, but rather eccentric in the traditional Oxford style. So when I decided I wanted to go on to do a doctorate, I discussed it with Tony, and he suggested I come and study with him, and that we both agreed that I should do some subject on what was then, in the late 60s, the cutting edge question, which was about continuity in modern German history, the long-term origins of Nazism, and the extent to which the middle classes, in particular in Germany, had been, as it were, softened up for Nazism, preparing today, voting for it in the early 1930s. And we cast around for a subject, but Jill Stevenson, the Scottish historian, had just published a book, her thesis on women in Nazi Germany, and she commented to Tony at a seminar on the lack of serious studies of German feminisms, and that's what I chose to do. We all, at that time, a whole lot of us chose to do the history of organizations and pressure groups. This was a convenient thing to do in the sense that they generated and left behind them lots of papers and lots of material, and it was also a middle-class movement of social reform. There'd been a lot of work on it in British history. So that's what I did. And Tony was a wonderful supervisor in the sense that he sustained me when I was feeling doubtful about the subject. I went to Germany, and archivists, particularly in East Germany, in fact, were extremely puzzled and skeptical as to why I, a Brit, should be studying German history and a man studying the history of feminism. And Tony is also really, really helpful in a number of ways that I don't think anybody else could have been. So he was a great organizer of scholarship and of Anglo-German exchanges, scholarly exchanges between historians. He set up and brought over the many historians under the Volkswagen scheme. That's where I met Fritz Fischer, Lutz Niethammer, and a number of other major German historians. And I was also very lucky because Willy Brandt got an honorary degree at Oxford, and he, as a kind of reward or thanks, dished out free language tuition scholarships to Oxford students, which I got one, thanks to Tony. There's also the Hanseatic scholarships, again, which Tony backed me, and I got one of the first two to be after the reinstatement in 1970. And in many other ways, he was just enormously helpful. For example, I couldn't get into the Federal Archives to see a key set of private papers because the archivist said, well, they include stuff that's within the last 30 years, so we haven't sorted out yet. Clearly, they were thought it was rather unimportant by the archivists because they were papers of a leading feminist. And I reported this to Tony in some frustration. He said, oh, wait a minute, I know the archivist, he's been here and he would quite like a visiting fellowship. And so he did. And then I got a letter from the archivist saying, yes, you do come, so long as you promise when you come across the things that I've written within the last 30 years not to use them. But I was interested really only in the period before 1933, and I was quite happy to do that. Later on, he read my drafts, commented on the structure, and in general was extremely helpful. You did get that kind of close supervision you have to have now with regular reports and scheduled meetings and ticking boxes and filling forms. It was all very informal. Of course, there were no smartphones, no mobiles, no internet, no email. Communication was much more difficult, but I wrote him regular letters, and he wrote me back, encouraging me in his rather difficult to decipher handwriting. He was, and of course, I became a doctor of philosophy, largely thanks to his solid backing and support. I'll always be extremely grateful to him. And also, of course, to everything that he set up, not just the Volkswagen exchange scheme, but other exchange schemes, seminars, visiting lectures, all of those sorts of things. Because I met Fritz Fischer at Oxford, I was able to go and study with him in Hamburg, fortunately supported by the Hanseatic scholarships. I met Fischer's extraordinary group of assistenten, and it provided a kind of milieu for me, which I otherwise would not have had. So I'm extremely grateful to Tony. I remember him very fondly indeed, and it gave me a fantastic start on my academic career. He supported that afterwards by writing endless references, and I know he must have written me very good ones because I got some great jobs in University of East Anglia, Birkbeck, and other places. So that's it. Again, I'm very sorry I can't be with you in person. I hope the event does him proud, and I look forward to seeing the recording of it in due course when I'm back from Bratislava. Thank you very, very much.
Now that I've really tested technical skills, we're going to hopefully go on live to Jurgen Kocka, who another historian who needs no introduction. If Jurgen, if you're there.
Yes, I'm here. Good evening to everybody. Can you hear me?
Hear you very well, and we can see you too. That's brilliant.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me to say something about Tony as a historian of Germany, from the perspective of a German historian. I'm speaking from Berlin, where I taught modern history at the Free University before I retired. Always good neighbors, never good friends, ? Anglo-German relations 1949 to 2001. This was the title of the annual lecture at the German Historical Institute in London, which Tony Nicholls delivered in 2004. Tony discussed the long lines of Anglo-German relations in the second half of the 20th century, concentrating on foreign policy issues and on relations between governments. He presented a mixed picture: friendly relations between allies with common interests, yes, but at the same time disagreements. For instance, when Willy Brandt started to have his new Eastern policy in the early 70s, tensions with respect to German unification in 1990, and again with respect to policies of European integration. Tony argued that, quote, Anglo-German antagonism is not a natural state, but is stimulated by government policies that bring our two countries into unnecessary conflict. And he concluded, quote, as someone who has gained enormously from my experience of life in Germany, I can only be optimistic about our future relationship. Nevertheless, things could be better than they are, and that is a pity. Such a statement might perhaps make sense today as well. At the same time, Tony emphasized, again I quote, that in the field of historical studies and indeed of academic endeavor generally, the British and the Germans are good friends and have been so for many years. Tony, as a person, has contributed much to the close and fruitful relationship between the historical professions in Britain and Germany, still existing today. He has written important, pertinent books in which he, on the one hand, analyzed the rise of National Socialism and some of its long-term consequences. And on the other hand, he presented the Federal Republic of Germany as a relatively successful, increasingly democratic country, very much in contrast to its Nazi past, a kind of new Germany. Now, he did this never uncritically, but with fairness and sympathy. His deeply researched book, Freedom with Responsibility, the social market, soziale Marktwirtschaft, the social market economy in Germany of 1994 has remained one of the best interpretations of the genesis and the character of our socio-economic order in the second half of the 20th century. Tony has educated and trained a large number of students, PhDs. Nowadays, some of them belong to the most distinguished British historians of Europe and Germany. Tony was the founding chairman of the German History Society of England, of Britain. He contributed to founding the German Historical Institute in London. Most important, perhaps, among his institutional achievements, and this was just mentioned before, is the visiting fellowship. Most of the time, the Volkswagen visiting fellowship, which he, in cooperation with his German colleague and friend, Gerhard Aritter, established in 1965. Over the years, this program has brought a large number of German historians, leading ones, younger ones, to St. Anthony's College, where they studied and wrote, where they gave talks about their fields and published and got into contact with British and international colleagues. Now this program continues to exist, is known as the Richard von Weizsäcker Visiting Fellowship. To be invited as a Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow to St. Anthony's continues to be an outstanding distinction and honor. And there is a broader context to this. Close contacts with colleagues and intellectuals from other countries, especially from Western countries, were indeed of great importance for the generation of German, and I'm thinking of West German historians who tried to restore professional integrity, excellence, and recognition after World War II, after the catastrophic breakdown of National Socialism that happened in the early years and even early decades of the Federal Republic. So visits to and fellowships in and professional contacts with the US, the UK, and slightly less important France were important steps on this way. The rebuilding of the historical profession and of academic life in other spheres as well was supported by an increasing density of transnational contacts, in those decades mainly with the West. There emerged centers, hubs for this kind of intellectual transnationalism. Places like the Center for West European Studies, now European Studies at Harvard, or the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme in Paris, under Prodel and Heller, and in England, Oxford, St. Anthony's. Due to several factors, among them very important, the enduring initiatives of Tony, for which he, of course, received decisive support from his college and his environment. So we remember his legacy with much satisfaction and gratitude. Thank you for your patience.
Some may wonder why I've been asked to speak on this occasion to honour Tony's contribution to this college, to Oxford, and more widely. After all, our academic interests have been very different. I'm a lawyer, and I first met him only in the mid-1990s. I bumped into him only very occasionally in his last 20 years or so. Nevertheless, I feel honoured to be here today to pay tribute to him. And let me explain why. When 30 years ago, I was asked to become Oxford's next Vice Chancellor, I had, under the system then in operation, more than 2 years to brood on the challenge before taking up the office. I used part of that time, with the agreement of the then Vice Chancellor, Sir Richard Southwood, to visit every faculty and every department in the university, to seek views on what was and what was not good about the ways in which our university was run. Dissatisfaction was clear. There was a general feeling of remoteness from the centre, coupled with a concern that major decisions who are being taken by small groups of people who had no real understanding of the ways in which different subjects were taught or research therein was or ought to be organised. So when I took over as Vice-Chancellor in 1993, I suggested to Council that it was time to have a good hard think about the university's structure, their operation, and their effectiveness, given that some 3 decades had passed since the wide-ranging Franks report in 1965. So Council decided to appoint a committee, typical, to decide whether a similar wide-ranging investigation and analysis was desirable. The outcome was the establishment of a commission of inquiry to undertake what turned out to be a 3-year review of the whole way in which the university operated. The commission that was established was an 8-person body, chaired by me. I have to say, my idea would be somebody else should do it, but it was chaired by me, and whose other members were drawn from within Oxford, apart from 2 distinguished outsiders, the head of other academic institutions, and both later distinguished members of the House of Lords. The Oxford members of the review provided a wide range of academic experience: an undergraduate tutorial fellow, a graduate college fellow, Tony, a head of house, 2 professors, and myself. And the academic interests of the 8 spanned medicine, science, humanities, and the social sciences. When Tony agreed to serve, he brought to the review a very important sense of the needs and concerns of graduate students, along with the particular perspective of a member of a graduate college, coupled with his own scholarly understanding. Serving on the commission made considerable demands on our time and significant inroads into our busy lives. There were nearly 50 meetings of the full commission, as well as a range of subcommittees. Many of the commission meetings started in the afternoon and continued through and after dinner in my lodgings at Jesus. More than a dozen were 2-day whole weekend meetings at what used to be the home of Templeton College. That is, well away in the woods, free from other distractions. In addition to the full meetings, there were a whole series of subcommittee meetings. So Tony's commitment in time alone was clearly considerable. And not only was he a very loyal attender, but also a most thoughtful contributor to our discussions. He was able to provide a particular perspective in understanding the life and challenges of graduate students, as well as ensuring that the Commission was fully conscious of the university issues, particularly affecting graduate colleges. In fact, just about a third of the Commission's 93 recommendations related to graduate education and the organisation and support of graduate research. Much of this was due to Tony's input and influence on our deliberations. Although the current generation will no doubt see many ways of improving the operation of our university, I take the view that it's not done too badly in the quarter of a century since Tony and I and our colleagues reported. I've been told that Tony said that he was proud to have been a member of the Commission of Inquiry. For my part, I'm proud to have had him as a colleague and indeed a friend.
I think somebody should mention that through this delay, we have chosen the 9th of November as the day to commemorate Tony, which for every German historian is a significant date, one of the worst and one of the best dates in German history, notably Kristallnacht in 1938 and the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. I, like many people who've spoken, first got to know Tony as an undergraduate, taking the Third Reich special subject. And this was 1976, so when I think about it, this centre must just have been opened. I have to admit that for me, it was just a rather modern building, a long way up the Woodstock Road, but actually it was clearly the European Studies Centre, in that tiny office, which Tony so modestly chose, leaving the much larger centre office for his assistant, sitting on that very 1970s electric green chair, which we still have, one of the survivals from that time. He was a wonderful tutor, particularly, as has been mentioned, in combination with Tim Mason. They were a fantastic duo. Tim Mason, with his great Marxist theoretical ambitions, trying to fit the whole of the history of Nazism into a clear structure, and Tony, with his sharp English skeptical empirical mind, citing the pieces of evidence that destroyed that neat structure. I got to know him better when I became a fellow of the college in 1990 and of this centre. Roger said that it was Tony's academic home, but actually he created this home. It would not exist without Tony. As Christine records in her wonderful history of the college, he succeeded in securing this very large endowment from the Volkswagen Foundation to endow this center. German foundations do not endow. It never happens. So this was already an extraordinary achievement. And his second great achievement was to make sure that we didn't get the Oscar Niemeyer masterpiece of modern architecture, which would have been admired by generations of students of architecture and would have bankrupted the college for generations to come. But instead, rather brilliantly secured the freehold and renovation of this building, 70 Woodstock Road, and number 83 and 85 Woodstock Road. Anyone who knows anything about North Oxford property prices knows just how valuable that endowment is financially to the college. This, I sometimes think, would be a perfect house for a Russian oligarch or Chinese princeling or Saudi prince. But fortunately, it's a European Studies Centre, and that we owe to Tony. The history of the centre during his directorship, which lasted from 1976 to 2001, so a quarter century, falls essentially into two halves: the West European Centre and the European Studies Centre. So the first period from 76 until the fall of the Berlin Wall, of course, at the heart of what everything did was this incredibly intense academic and personal relationship with Germany, has been mentioned, this amazing tradition of visiting fellows. I'm glad to say that we have the latest of these German visiting fellows with us today, Martin Schulze-Wessel, continuing what is an extraordinary roll of honor of the German historical profession. I'm now going to be the third person to mention Fritz Fischer. I didn't know that everybody else was going to mention Fritz Fischer. But I remember him particularly, as you all know, the great Fritz Fischer controversy about German war aims in the First World War, Tony very kindly got me seated next to him at dessert after high table. And as the lights went down in the fellows' dining room and the candles were lit and faces were illuminated by candlelight, Fritz Fischer turned to me and said, "Es sieht aus wie eine Verschwörung." It looks like a conspiracy. I thought it was quite revealing of Fritz Fischer's particular cast of mind, that he would think a bunch of fellows at dessert after high table looked like a conspiracy. But Tony cultivated those relations magnificently throughout this period and beyond. But at the same time, we had, particularly thanks to Raymond Carr, an incredibly strong presence on Spain and Portugal. We had an Iberian Studies Center. We had the great and somewhat Borgesian figure, Herminio Martins. We had many distinguished scholars on Spain, not least our colleague Charles Powell, who's gone on to great things in Madrid. On France, of course, we had Theodore Zeldin, with whom Tony had a very interesting relationship. On economic history, we had Paddy O'Brien, it's wonderful to see back here. And on Italy, we had, of course, Adrian Littleton. So in that period, the West European Studies Center really covered the whole of Western Europe in depth and in many disciplines, including culture and history, sociology, the history of ideas. The second phase started with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Ralph Downdorf was then the warden. I had just joined the college as a fellow. This was a period of what I would like to call not post-war Europe, but post-wall Europe. And in recognition of the great changes in Central and Eastern Europe, we renamed the center, the European Studies Center. The Russian Center was renamed the Russian and Eurasian Studies Center. And since then, our mission has been to study the whole of Europe and Europe as a whole. We did a huge amount of work in the 1990s on Germany, on the process of German unification, witnessed the many, many volumes to Hartmut's right on German unification, documenting German unification. We had Helmut Kohl as a visitor 3 times to this center. First as an extremely provincial, newly minted leader of the opposition. Second, as a European leader, the Chancellor of West Germany, and the third time as the ginormous in every respect, Chancellor of German unity. Tony has been mentioned, and Jurgen Kocka spoke about this eloquently. His particular concern was British-German relations, which were actually rather good in the 1990s, once we got over Margaret Thatcher. I'm rather glad he didn't live to see the account we gave of British-German relations today at our seminar a couple of weeks ago. I think he would have been justifiably depressed. We did a lot of work in that period on East Central Europe, on Southeastern Europe. Richard Clogg, of course, was our fellow on modern Greek history, but also on the EU in a very hopeful period of its history. William Wallace, now a Liberal Democrat peer, Jack Hayward and others did a great deal of really important work on the European Union as a whole in the lead up to enlargement. What were the particular qualities that Tony brought to this job, to the directorship of this center, to be a fellow of this college? I would say 4. First of all, I have to say intellectually, the older I get, the more I value judgment over brilliance. The brilliance that one finds in some revisionist historians of Germany was not, no names, no backdrop, was not Tony's thing, but he had superb judgment. And that is a quality, I think, without price. Secondly, it's been mentioned already, I think Caroline mentioned that he was calm at home. He was also calm in this centre and in the college. Always calm, careful, deliberate decision-making. Harold Macmillan's motto, calm, cool deliberation, untangles every knot, was very much Tony's. The third quality was his humour. Tony had a wonderful sense of humour. An anecdote normally prefaced by being accosted as old boy, slightly archaic form of accostation, but I rather like that, old boy. I remember, for example, one of his favorite stories, Christine touches on it in the book, is when we got Lyudmila Zhivkova, the daughter of the longtime communist leader of Bulgaria, as a student at the college. And the college administration, knowing nothing about this, had put her in one of the rather grotty rooms at the top of the Victorian house. And I have to tell you that at that time, St. Anthony's rooms could be very grotty. Kitchen 2 floors down and so on. A few weeks beforehand, 3 enormous black ZIL limousines turned up at the entrance to the college. Delegation from Bulgarian embassy. Can we inspect accommodation for Madame Zhivkova? Rather rapidly, Madame Zhivkova was shunted into a very comfortable flat, actually in this building instead of the Woodstock Road, with her elaborate wardrobe and water polo playing husband and so on. The result of that artful move was that we then got something called the Lyudmila Zhivkova Foundation, with some help from Robert Maxwell, which brought many excellent Bulgarian visitors to the college. And I remember Tony telling me this. A few weeks after Todor Zhivkov was finally toppled in the Velvet Revolutions of 1989, there was a meeting of the Lyudmila Zhivkova Foundation, and the minutes record that Mr. Robert Maxwell, that pillar of moral integrity, proposed that this foundation should be renamed the St. Cyril and Methodius Foundation. That was a story that Tony loved. But last and most of all, he had a real sense of the dignity and seriousness of what we do in this university. And woe betide someone who made a proposal, whether in the centre or in governing body, which put that in question, where he thought that was not the right thing. And then suddenly you would see there was real steel there. And I think, Roger, you may remember this at governing body. Suddenly there'd be a moment when he became very tough and said, that's not right, and we're not going to do that. And most of the time, he got his way. So we miss him very much, but he lives on in this building, which he secured for the college, and in this centre, which he created.
Thank you, Timothy, and thank you to all our speakers. That was absolutely fantastic. Everybody's invited to a drinks reception in the refurbished Hilda Best, recently reopened Hilda Best, winner of the Oxford Preservation Trust Conservation Prize of the Year, as of last Tuesday. I have to share that bit of information. But before we go, should we have one more look at the slides? Could we do that? That Christine kindly put together for us. I don't know if there's any commentary that goes with these slides. We're slightly mystified about where some of these slides are taken. Maybe share that. Maybe Christine might know. And lights, we can put the lights down. Very. The suspense. There we go.
That was the day we were married. We went to visit my parents who lived in Kenya. That's Tony punching my mother and children when they were babies. That's a holiday on the Norfolk Broads when Tony filled the petrol tank with water. We had to abort the holiday. Beijing.
That's the Northern Commission. Have I got those names right?
No, they're gone.
That was Tony getting his honorary degree from Munich University.
That's great.
Oh, South Africa, Table Mountains. Oh, there we are.
That's the other one. The other one. We are. So thank you very much, everybody. And just to say thank you to all of those who are online. And shall we repair to the senior common room for a drink?